The marriage contract lay before her like a death sentence, its elegant script mocking the sacrifice she was about to make. Lady Helena Langford's trembling hand hovered over the parchment as the Duke of Gravesmore watched from across the table, his grey eyes cold as winter frost. He had vowed to destroy the Langford name, to see her family ruined and cast from society forever. Yet here she sat, about to bind herself to him for eternity, not for love, not for honour, but for her sister's salvation. The Duke's lips curved into a cruel smile as he pushed the quill closer. "Sign it, Lady Helena," he murmured, "and perhaps your precious sister might yet escape the ruin I have planned for your house." If you're listening to this story, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments which part of the world you're listening from. I want to know how far it has travelled. The Langford estate of Thornfield Manor stood proud against the English countryside, its limestone facade gleaming in the weak autumn sunlight of 1815. To the casual observer, the house represented generations of noble lineage and refined breeding. But Lady Helena Langford, standing at her bedroom window overlooking the manicured gardens, saw only the golden bars of a cage that had held her family captive for far too long. At 22 years of age, Helena possessed the kind of understated beauty that whispered rather than proclaimed. Dark auburn hair that caught fire in candlelight, intelligent hazel eyes that missed little, and a quiet grace that had made her a favourite among the kinder matrons of London society. Yet for all her accomplishments in watercolours, French and pianoforte, she had learned that a woman's true worth in Regency England was measured not by her mind, but by her marriageability and her family's fortune. And the Langford fortune was crumbling. Her father, the Earl of Thornfield, had made disastrous investments in a shipping venture that had ended in spectacular failure. Creditors circled like vultures, and whispers of bankruptcy haunted every drawing room in London. The family's fall from grace had been swift and merciless, their invitations dwindling, their credit denied, their name becoming synonymous with reckless speculation and impending ruin. But it was her younger sister, Beatrice, who occupied Helena's every waking thought. At 18, Beatrice possessed a delicate beauty and sweet temperament that had captured the affection of Lord Edmund Hartley, the second son of a respectable family. The young man's devotion was genuine, and Beatrice returned his feelings with all the ardent passion of first love. They had planned to marry in the spring, a union that would have secured Beatrice's future and brought joy to a household that had known precious little of late. Then the Duke of Gravesmore had returned to England. Alexander Gravesmore, the 7th Duke of Gravesmore, was a man whose reputation preceded him like a storm cloud. He had spent the better part of 5 years on the continent, managing his vast estates, and rumour suggested conducting affairs of both business and pleasure with a ruthlessness that had made him legendary. At 31, he possessed the kind of dark, austere handsomeness that made debutantes swoon and their mothers calculate. Strong features, black hair touched with silver at the temples, and those piercing grey eyes that seemed to see through every pretence. But it was not his appearance that made Helena's blood run cold. It was his vendetta. 20 years ago, Helena's father had been involved in a parliamentary vote that had cost the 6th Duke of Gravesmore, Alexander's father, a valuable land grant. The elder Duke had never forgiven the slight, and on his deathbed he had made his son swear to exact revenge upon the Langford family. Alexander Gravesmore, a man who held honour and family loyalty above all else, had taken that oath seriously. Upon his return to England, the Duke had systematically begun to dismantle the Langford family's remaining social standing. He had called in old debts that the late Duke had held over Helena's father, debts that had been quietly forgotten for years. He had used his considerable influence to ensure that no bank would extend further credit to the Earl. He had whispered words in the right ears, ensuring that Lord Edmund Hartley's family would never consent to a marriage alliance with the disgraced Langford house. Helena had watched her father age 10 years in as many months, his shoulders bowing under the weight of accumulated failures and the knowledge that he had brought ruin upon his beloved daughters. She had held Beatrice as her sister wept over the letter from Edmund, explaining with heartbreaking regret that his family had forbidden the match. It was during one of those long, sleepless nights that Helena had conceived her desperate plan. The Duke of Gravesmore, for all his wealth and power, remained unmarried. He needed an heir to secure his vast holdings, but his years abroad and his fearsome reputation had made him an unlikely prospect for the matchmaking mamas of the ton. He required a wife of good breeding, someone whose lineage was impeccable, even if her fortune was not. Helena's maid, the faithful Mary, had connections below stairs at Gravesmore House in London. Through careful inquiry, Helena had learned that the Duke intended to attend the Beaumont Ball, one of the final major events of the little season. It was there that Helena planned to make her proposition, herself for her family's salvation. The morning of the Beaumont Ball dawned grey and cold, with rain threatening from heavy clouds that hung over London like a shroud. Helena stood in her modest chamber at the Langford townhouse, staring at the reflection in her looking-glass. Her maid had dressed her in a gown of deep emerald silk, one of the few remaining pieces from happier times. It complemented her colouring beautifully, bringing out the gold in her hazel eyes and the warmth of her skin. "You look beautiful, my lady," Mary said softly, adjusting the simple pearl necklace that had been Helena's mother's, one of the last pieces of jewellery not yet sold to pay debts. "Beautiful enough to attract a devil, I hope," Helena murmured, her reflection showing a woman who appeared far more confident than she felt. The ballroom at Beaumont House blazed with candlelight, casting golden shadows across the assembled guests. Helena entered with her father and sister, acutely aware of the whispers that followed their progress, the subtle shifting of bodies that left them isolated islands in a sea of silk and jewels. Beatrice clung to her arm, her young face pale and drawn, her eyes searching the crowd for a glimpse of Edmund Hartley, even though she knew he would not be there. "Courage, dearest," Helena whispered, squeezing her sister's hand. "This night may change everything." "Odile!" The Duke of Gravesmore stood near the far wall, surrounded by a coterie of admirers and sycophants. Even from across the room, his presence dominated the space. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in impeccable black evening clothes that made him look like a dangerous predator among peacocks. His expression was one of aristocratic boredom as a young widow fluttered her fan at him suggestively. Helena took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and began to walk toward her enemy. She was aware of her father's startled exclamation behind her, of Beatrice's whispered plea to stop, but she did not falter. The crowd seemed to part before her like the Red Sea, conversations dying as heads turned to watch this act of social suicide. The Duke noticed her approach, his eyes narrowing slightly as he recognized her. The widow beside him fell silent mid-sentence, following his gaze with growing alarm. By the time Helena reached him, a circle of silence had spread through the ballroom, like ripples on a pond. "Your Grace," Helena said, her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. She executed a perfect curtsy, neither too shallow to give offence, nor too deep to suggest subservience. "Lady Helena," his voice was deep, cultured, edged with ice. "This is unexpected. I was not aware that my soirée were open to those whose families have fallen on difficult times." "Odile," the insult was deliberate, designed to wound and humiliate. Helena felt the colour rise in her cheeks, heard the collective gasp from the watching crowd, but she held his gaze without flinching. "Indeed, Your Grace, that is precisely why I wish to speak with you. Perhaps we might step onto the terrace. I have a proposition that may interest you." Something flickered in those grey eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or curiosity. For a long moment, he simply studied her, and Helena had the unsettling sensation of being thoroughly assessed and catalogued. Then, to the astonishment of everyone present, the Duke offered her his arm. "By all means, Lady Helena. I am most curious to hear what proposition the daughter of my enemy could possibly offer me. The terrace was blessedly empty, the chill November air having driven the other guests inside. Helena moved to the stone balustrade, gripping it to steady herself as the Duke closed the French doors behind them, muting the music and chatter from within. "Speak then," he said, positioning himself a careful distance away, his expression unreadable. "What desperate scheme has brought you to beard the lion in his den?" Helena turned to face him, and in that moment she felt a strange clarity descend upon her. This was not a game or a negotiation where pride mattered. This was survival. "I know that you seek to destroy my family, Your Grace. I know that you have sworn an oath to see the Langford name dragged through the mud and cast out from decent society. I know that you have blocked my sister's chance at happiness with Lord Edmund, that you have ensured my father's financial ruin, and that you will not rest until we are utterly destroyed." "You are remarkably well informed," the Duke said, his tone betraying no emotion. "Continue." "I also know that you require a wife, a woman of good breeding and impeccable lineage, to provide you with heirs and manage your households. You need someone who understands the obligations of rank and will not shame you in society." Now his expression did shift, a dark amusement playing about his lips. "You propose yourself as a candidate for this position. How audacious." "I propose a bargain, Your Grace." Helena's voice remained steady, though her hands gripped the stone hard enough to hurt. "I will marry you. I will give you the heirs you require and fulfill every duty expected of a duchess. I will manage your homes and entertain your guests and never cause you a moment's embarrassment. In exchange, you will leave my family in peace. You will restore what credit you have destroyed. You will use your influence to secure Lord Edmund's family's blessing for his marriage to Beatrice. And you will ensure my father can live out his remaining years in modest comfort." The Duke was silent for a long moment, his eyes never leaving hers. Then he moved closer, and Helena had to force herself not to step back from his intimidating presence. "You would sacrifice yourself to save them," he said softly, and something in his voice had changed, though Helena could not identify what. "You would bind yourself in marriage to a man who hates your family, who has sworn to destroy everything you hold dear, in the hope that I might show mercy." "Not hope, Your Grace. Negotiation. You need a wife. I need my family's salvation. It is a practical arrangement that benefits us both." "And what of love? Of affection? Do you not harbor dreams of marrying for romantic attachment, as your sister wishes to do?" Helena laughed, a bitter sound that seemed to surprise them both. "Love is a luxury for those who can afford it, Your Grace. I gave up such dreams the moment I realized the depth of my family's troubles. I'm not asking for your affection or your companionship. I'm offering you a transaction, my hand and my duty in exchange for your mercy." The Duke studied her face in the moonlight, his expression inscrutable. "You have courage, Lady Helena. Foolish, desperate courage, but courage nonetheless." He paused, then said, "I will consider your proposition. But know this, if I accept, I will hold you to every word of your promise. You will be mine completely, bound by law and by honor. There will be no escape, no changing your mind. Do you understand?" "I understand perfectly, Your Grace." "Then I shall send you my answer within 3 days. Return to your family now, before your reputation suffers further damage from this imprudent meeting." Helena curtsied again and turned to leave, but his voice stopped her at the door. "Lady Helena, one more thing. If we proceed with this marriage, you will discover that I am not a kind man. I do not forgive easily, and I do not forget at all. I trust you are prepared for what you are inviting into your life." Helena met his gaze one final time. "I trust you are prepared for what you are inviting into yours, Your Grace." She left him standing alone on the terrace, and it was only when she reached the safety of her father's carriage that she allowed herself to tremble. 3 days later, a formal letter arrived at Thornfield Manor, sealed with the Gravesmore crest. Helena opened it with shaking hands, her father and sister watching anxiously. The Duke's answer was brief. "I accept your terms. The marriage contract will be drawn up immediately. We wed in 1 month's time." Gravesmore. The wedding preparations proceeded with the mechanical efficiency of a military campaign. The Duke of Gravesmore, having accepted Helena's proposition, showed no inclination towards sentiment or romance in the arrangements. The marriage contract arrived within a week, a document so thorough and exacting that it might have been drafted for the acquisition of property rather than the union of two souls. Helena read through the clauses with her father's solicitor, her heart sinking with each stipulation. She would have a generous allowance for her personal expenses, but all major decisions regarding the ducal properties would rest with her husband. She would be expected to reside wherever the Duke deemed appropriate and to entertain, according to his specifications. Her correspondence would be her own, but she would be expected to sever all financial ties with her family. The Duke would assume their debts and provide for them separately, but Helena herself would have no direct control over those arrangements. It was, in every sense, a contract of surrender. "This is unconscionable," her father said, his weathered hands trembling as he held the document. "Helena, you cannot possibly—" "I can and I will, father," Helena interrupted gently. She had not told him the full truth of her bargain with the Duke, allowing him to believe that Gravesmore had made the offer himself, perhaps out of a grudging respect for her dignity. It was kinder than admitting she had bartered herself like a merchant's daughter trading goods. "It secures Beatrice's future and ensures you will not spend your final years in debtor's prison. That is all that matters." Beatrice had wept for days when she learned of the engagement, torn between joy at the restoration of her prospects with Edmund and horror at the price Helena was paying. But youth was resilient, and gradually the younger girl's natural optimism had begun to reassert itself, especially when Lord Edmund had called personally at Thornfield Manor to renew his addresses, his family's objections mysteriously withdrawn. The Duke had kept his word on that count at least. Helena clung to that small mercy as the wedding day approached with inexorable speed. The ceremony was to take place at St. George's Church in Hanover Square, the fashionable venue for society weddings. Despite the short notice, the Duke had insisted on a full formal affair, whether to parade his victory over the Langford family or to demonstrate his new Duchess's legitimacy. Helena could not say. Perhaps both. The morning of her wedding dawned clear and cold, a December day that sparkled with frost and promised winter's full arrival. Helena woke in her childhood bedroom at Thornfield Manor for the last time, staring at the familiar ceiling while Mary bustled about preparing her wedding attire. The gown had been a surprise, arriving from Madame Beauchamp's exclusive establishment with a note in the Duke's angular script. "A duchess requires appropriate attire. G." It was a masterpiece of ivory silk and Brussels lace, cut in the latest fashion with a high waist and delicate puff sleeves. The veil was worked with seed pearls that caught the light like morning dew, and the entire ensemble must have cost a fortune. Helena appreciated the irony. She was to be beautifully packaged for her own sacrifice. As Mary dressed her, Helena studied her reflection in the looking-glass. The woman who stared back looked like a duchess already, pale and composed, her hair arranged in elegant curls, crowned by the pearl-studded veil. Only her eyes betrayed her, showing depths of apprehension and resignation that no amount of cosmetics could disguise. "You'll be the most beautiful bride London has seen in years, my lady," Mary said loyally, but her voice caught on the words. "Perhaps," Helena replied, touching the pearls at her throat. "Another gift from the Duke, an antique Gravesmore necklace that felt like a collar. But beauty is cold comfort when one is walking to one's doom." The carriage ride to London seemed both endless and too brief. Helena sat beside her father, who had been uncharacteristically silent all morning. Finally, as the spires of St. George's came into view, he spoke. "It is not too late to refuse, Helena. We could leave England, start anew somewhere. With what funds, father? Helena kept her voice gentle but firm. We would be pursued by creditors across the globe. And what of Beatrice? Would you have her lose Edmund because of my cowardice? She took his weathered hand in hers. I go to this marriage with open eyes. The Duke and I have an understanding. It will suffice. The church was filled to capacity, a fact that surprised Helena until she realized that curiosity had drawn the ton like moths to flame. Everyone wanted to witness the spectacle of a Langford daughter marrying the Duke, who had sworn to destroy her family. It was the kind of delicious scandal that would fuel drawing-room gossip for months. As Helena descended from the carriage, she heard the whispers rippling through the crowd of onlookers gathered outside the church. Some pitied her, others admired her courage, and many simply enjoyed the drama of it all. She held her head high and took her father's arm, allowing him to lead her up the steps and into the church. The interior of St. George's was magnificent, decorated with white roses and holly, traditional, elegant, expensive. Helena's eyes travelled the length of the aisle to where the Duke of Gravesmore waited before the altar, and her breath caught despite her determination to remain unmoved. He was dressed in formal mourning attire of black and grey, his dark hair immaculately styled, his expression as austere and unreadable as a marble statue. But it was his eyes that captured her attention. Those grey eyes that watched her approach with an intensity that made her feel simultaneously exposed and invisible. The ceremony passed in a blur of ritual and response. Helena spoke her vows in a clear voice that betrayed none of her inner turmoil, promising to love, honour and obey a man who viewed her as little more than a strategic acquisition. The Duke's voice was equally steady, his vows delivered with the precision of a legal contract rather than a sacred promise. When the moment came to place the ring upon her finger, Helena felt the cold weight of gold and gemstones, a massive sapphire surrounded by diamonds, a Gravesmore family heirloom that dated back 2 centuries. It was beautiful and heavy, a shackle disguised as jewelry. "You may kiss your bride," the Archbishop intoned, and for the first time Helena saw something flicker in the Duke's eyes, hesitation perhaps, or calculation. He leaned forward, and his lips brushed hers in a kiss so brief and cold it might have been the touch of winter itself. The church erupted in polite applause, and suddenly Helena was no longer Lady Helena Langford, but her Grace, the Duchess of Gravesmore. She turned to face the assembled guests on her husband's arm, and the reality of what she had done crashed over her like a wave. The wedding breakfast was held at Gravesmore House, the Duke's imposing London mansion on Grosvenor Square. Helena had never seen inside the house before, and she was struck by its austere magnificence, all dark wood panelling, ancestral portraits, and heavy furniture that spoke of centuries of power and privilege. It felt like a mausoleum, cold and unwelcoming, despite the blazing fires in every hearth. The breakfast itself was an ordeal of polite conversation and false congratulations. Helena sat at the head of the long dining table, her husband at the other end, the physical distance between them seeming symbolic of the emotional gulf that separated them. She smiled and thanked guests for their good wishes while pushing food around her plate, unable to eat under the weight of so many curious stares. It was during the toasts that disaster struck. The Duke rose from his seat, his wine glass in hand, and the room fell silent. Helena expected the traditional words of affection and promise that grooms typically offered their brides. Instead, she watched in growing horror as his expression shifted into something cold and cruel. "Ladies and gentlemen," the Duke began, his voice carrying easily through the hushed room, "I thank you for joining us today to witness this union. It is, I think, a fitting conclusion to a long and complicated history between our two families." Helena's hands clenched in her lap, a terrible premonition stealing over her. 20 years ago, the Duke continued, his eyes now fixed on Helena's father, the Earl of Thornfield voted against my father in Parliament, costing the Gravesmore family a valuable property that had been in our possession for generations. My father died believing he had been betrayed by men he considered friends. The guest shifted uncomfortably, unsure where this speech was leading. Helena wanted to stand, to stop what was coming, but she found herself frozen. On his deathbed, my father made me swear an oath to see the Langford family humbled, to strip them of their wealth and standing, to ensure they understood the consequences of their treachery. The Duke's smile was terrible to behold. I have fulfilled that oath. The Earl is bankrupt, his credit destroyed, his name synonymous with failure. And now I have taken the greatest prize of all, his daughter bound to me in marriage, to serve my household and bear my children, a Langford woman subjugated to Gravesmore authority for the rest of her natural life. The room erupted in shocked murmurs. Helena heard Beatrice cry out, saw her father rise with fury and shame warring on his face. But the Duke was not finished. Let this marriage stand as a monument to Gravesmore justice and Langford foolishness. My Duchess was offered to me like a lamb to slaughter, and I accepted because it amused me to see how far desperation could drive a proud family. To have a Langford woman serve me, obey me, bear the name of the family she wronged, what better revenge could my father have envisioned? Helena found her voice at last, standing with such force that her chair toppled backward. Your Grace, oh, do not mistake me, the Duke said, turning his cold gaze upon her at last. I will honor the terms of our agreement. Your family will be provided for, your sister's marriage will proceed, your father will live out his days in comfort. I am not without mercy, but you, Helena, will live every day knowing that you sold yourself to save them, and that your sacrifice will be remembered always as an act of defeat rather than nobility. He raised his glass in a mocking toast. To the Duchess of Gravesmore, may she serve her purpose well. The room had descended into chaos. Several guests had risen to leave, scandalized by the Duke's appalling breach of decorum. Helena's father was being restrained by friends as he shouted challenges and threats at Gravesmore. Beatrice had fainted into Edmund's arms, and Helena herself stood at the center of the storm, her face burning with humiliation while her heart turned to ice in her chest. She had known the Duke was cruel. She had known he held no affection for her. But she had not anticipated this public degradation, this calculated destruction of whatever dignity she might have retained. He had not merely married her, he had conquered her, and he wanted everyone to witness her defeat. The Duke watched the pandemonium with satisfaction, then set down his glass and walked toward Helena with measured steps. When he reached her, he spoke in a voice low enough that only she could hear. Did you truly believe I would simply forget my family's honor, that I would accept your bargain without extracting a price beyond the marriage itself? You are mine now, Helena, and I will ensure you never forget what it cost you to save those you love. Helena met his eyes, and in that moment something shifted inside her. The fear and shame began to transform into something harder, colder. If he wanted a war, then she would give him one. And you, Your Grace, she said with quiet venom, will spend the rest of your life bound to a woman who will despise you with every breath she takes. I hope your revenge tastes sweet, for you have purchased it at the cost of any chance at happiness in your own marriage. She swept past him, ignoring the stares and whispers, and made her way out of the dining room. She did not know where she was going. This house was foreign territory, and she had no allies here. But she could not remain in that room another moment, could not endure the pitying looks and scandalized whispers. She found herself in the library, a vast room lined with books from floor to ceiling. Helena collapsed into a chair by the fireplace and finally allowed the tears to come, great wrenching sobs that shook her entire frame. She had thought herself prepared for this marriage, had believed she understood the sacrifice she was making. But she had not anticipated this level of calculated cruelty, this deliberate humiliation. The door opened softly, and Helena looked up to see not her husband, but an elderly woman she did not recognize. The stranger was perhaps 60, dressed in elegant but subdued clothing, with kind eyes and silver hair arranged in a simple style. "Your Grace," the woman said, curtsying, "I am Mrs. Ashworth, the head housekeeper. I thought you might wish for some tea and privacy." Helena wiped her eyes, trying to compose herself. "That is kind of you, Mrs. Ashworth, but I imagine the entire household has heard what transpired in the dining room. I must seem quite pathetic." "You seem," Mrs. Ashworth said firmly, setting down a tea tray, "like a young woman who has been treated abominably by a man who should know better. I have served the Gravesmore family for 40 years, Your Grace, and I have never seen the Duke behave so dishonourably. His father would be ashamed." The unexpected defence brought fresh tears to Helena's eyes. "He hates me, hates my family, and I have bound myself to him forever." Mrs. Ashworth poured the tea and pressed a cup into Helena's hands. "The Duke is a complicated man, Your Grace. The death of his father wounded him deeply, and he has carried that pain like a festering wound for too long. But that does not excuse his behaviour today." She paused, then added quietly, "You have more strength than you know. I saw it in the way you walked out of that room. You may have been defeated today, but you were not destroyed. Remember that." Helena sipped the tea, drawing what comfort she could from its warmth. "What happens now?" "Now, Your Grace, you rest. Tomorrow you will wake up as the Duchess of Gravesmore, and you will face this house and its master with the dignity of your position. And in time, perhaps, you will find a way to survive this marriage, or even transcend it." As night fell over Grosvenor Square, Helena sat alone in her new chambers, still wearing her wedding gown, staring at the massive sapphire on her finger. Somewhere in this cold mansion, her husband was likely congratulating himself on his masterful revenge. But Helena was no longer weeping. Instead, she was planning. The days following the wedding were a study in glacial civility. The Duke of Gravesmore departed for his country estate in Derbyshire the morning after the disastrous wedding breakfast, citing business matters that required his immediate attention. He did not invite Helena to accompany him, and she did not ask. The relief she felt at his absence was profound, though she understood it for what it was: a temporary reprieve, not a pardon. Helena remained at Gravesmore House in London, a duchess in title but a prisoner in reality. The house staff treated her with impeccable respect, led by the stalwart Mrs. Ashworth, but Helena could sense their uncertainty about how to navigate the obvious hostility between the Duke and his new wife. She spent her days exploring the vast mansion, cataloguing its treasures and its secrets, learning the rhythms of a household that felt more like a fortress than a home. Letters arrived regularly from Thornfield Manor. Beatrice wrote effusively about her joy at Lord Edmund's renewed courtship and the wedding plans that were now moving forward for a spring ceremony. Her words were warm and loving, but Helena detected an underlying guilt that her younger sister was finding happiness while Helena herself was trapped in misery. She wrote back cheerfully, insisting that all was well, that the Duke was attentive and kind, lies that came easier in ink than they ever would have in person. Her father's letters were more restrained, filled with questions about her welfare that Helena deflected with practiced skill. He mentioned almost casually that several of his most pressing debts had been quietly resolved, and that he had received an invitation to rejoin his club, small signs that the Duke was indeed honoring the financial aspects of their bargain, even as he tortured its emotional dimensions. It was Mrs. Ashworth who suggested, 3 weeks into her residence at Gravesmore House, that Helena might benefit from a change of scenery. The Duke has a widowed aunt, Lady Agatha Gravesmore, who maintains a residence in Bath, the housekeeper said one morning as she supervised Helena's breakfast. She's quite elderly now, but a formidable woman. She did not attend the wedding due to her health, but I believe she has written to you. Helena recalled the letter that had arrived a few days prior, a brief note in an elegant, spidery hand, expressing regret at missing the ceremony and extending an invitation to visit Bath. She had dismissed it at the time, assuming it was merely polite formality. Lady Agatha is not like her nephew, Mrs. Ashworth continued, her voice carefully neutral. She is fair-minded and kind, and she has no patience for cruelty or vindictiveness. A few weeks in Bath might provide you with perspective, Your Grace, and companionship. Helena understood what was not being said, that the housekeeper was offering her an escape route, a place to recover from the emotional wounds of her marriage. Would the Duke approve? The Duke gave explicit instructions that you are to be afforded every courtesy and freedom befitting your rank, Mrs. Ashworth replied diplomatically. He said nothing about restricting your movements or associations. 2 days later, Helena found herself in a well-appointed carriage, travelling west toward Bath, accompanied by Mary and a footman. The winter countryside rolled past her window, frost-glazed fields giving way to rolling hills, and with each mile, Helena felt some of the oppressive weight lift from her chest. She was still the Duchess of Gravesmore, still bound by vows and contracts, but for a few weeks at least she could pretend to be simply Helena again. Bath in December was quieter than its summer season, but the city still hummed with genteel activity. Lady Agatha's residence was an elegant townhouse on the Royal Crescent, offering views of the city and surrounding hills. The lady herself was waiting in the drawing room when Helena arrived, a woman in her 70s with snow-white hair, bright blue eyes that missed nothing, and an imperious manner that reminded Helena instantly of the Duke, though tempered with warmth rather than ice. "So you are the girl who married my impossible nephew," Lady Agatha said without preamble, examining Helena through a lorgnette. "Come here, child. Let me look at you properly." Helena approached, suddenly feeling like a schoolgirl facing examination. Lady Agatha studied her for a long moment, then nodded with apparent satisfaction. "You have backbone. Good. You will need it with Alexander." She gestured to a chair. "Sit. We have much to discuss." Over tea and excellent seed cake, Lady Agatha extracted the full story of Helena's courtship and marriage, or the absence thereof. Helena found herself confiding details she had shared with no one else, perhaps because this sharp-eyed old woman seemed to see through pretense as easily as glass. "My nephew is a fool," Lady Agatha pronounced when Helena finished. "Brilliant in business, impeccable in honor, but an absolute fool when it comes to understanding human nature. His father filled his head with ideas about family pride and vengeance, and Alexander took those lessons too much to heart. Indeed, he made a vow to his dying father," Helena said, surprised to find herself defending the Duke. "Surely honor demanded he fulfill it." "Honor," Lady Agatha said with considerable asperity, "does not require cruelty. Honor does not demand that an innocent young woman be publicly humiliated for sins she did not commit. Alexander has confused vengeance with justice, and in doing so, he has dishonored himself far more than your father's parliamentary vote ever dishonored his father." The blunt assessment was strangely comforting. "The Duke made his feelings quite clear, my lady. He views our marriage as a victory over my family and a living reminder of his father's betrayal. What Alexander views and what Alexander needs are two very different things," Lady Agatha replied cryptically. "But we shall return to that subject. For now, you must recover yourself. You look exhausted, child. When did you last sleep properly? When did you last do something simply because it brought you joy?" Helena could not remember. The past weeks had been a blur of duty, humiliation, and survival. I do not recall." "Then that will be our first task," Lady Agatha declared. "Rest, recuperation, and rediscovery. You are the Duchess of Gravesmore now, whether my nephew appreciates it or not, and you will comport yourself accordingly. That means reclaiming your spirit, your intelligence, and your sense of self. It will not do for you to be merely a victim of his revenge. You must become something more." Over the following weeks, Helena began to understand what Lady Agatha meant. The old woman introduced her to a circle of Bath society that was markedly different from the shallow glitter of London. Scholars, writers, artists, and reformers who gathered in Lady Agatha's drawing room to debate philosophy, literature, and politics. Helena's education had been typical for a woman of her class, but she had always been curious, and she found herself drawn into conversations about subjects she had never been encouraged to explore. It was at one of these gatherings that she met Dr. Elias Galworth, and her world shifted once again. Dr. Galworth was perhaps 35, recently returned from several years serving with the Army Medical Corps during the final campaigns against Napoleon. He was not conventionally handsome, his features were too irregular, his frame too lean from hardship, but there was an intensity to him that caught Helena's attention. He spoke passionately about establishing clinics for the poor, about advances in medicine that could save countless lives if only they were made available beyond the wealthy elite. "You have radical ideas, Dr. Galworth," Helena observed during their first conversation, intrigued despite herself. "I have humane ideas, Your Grace," he replied with a smile that softened his austere features. "Having seen men die needlessly because they lacked access to proper care, I find it difficult to be content with the status quo." Helena found herself attending more of Lady Agatha's gatherings, drawn not just by the intellectual stimulation, but by the doctor's presence. They began to converse regularly, discussing topics far beyond medicine: philosophy, literature, the rights of women, the future of England in the post-war era. Dr. Galworth treated her as an intellectual equal, valuing her opinions and engaging with her ideas in a way no man had before. "You have a sharp mind, Your Grace," he told her one afternoon as they walked through Sydney Gardens, chaperoned at a discreet distance by Mary. "It is a pity that society does not encourage women to pursue academic interests more seriously." "Society," Helena said with some bitterness, "does not encourage women to pursue anything beyond marriage and motherhood. We are ornaments, Doctor, valued for our appearance and our connections, not our thoughts." "Then society is foolish and impoverished for it," Dr. Galworth replied. "Some of the most intelligent people I have known were women, nurses who understood anatomy and disease better than many physicians, officers' wives who managed complex logistics, even a French woman physician I met in Paris who could diagnose by observation alone. Intelligence is not the province of one sex." Oh, it was the kind of conversation Helena had never had with her husband. The Duke viewed her as a possession, a means to an end. Dr. Galworth saw her as a person, complete and complex. The contrast was both exhilarating and painful. She was careful to maintain perfect propriety in their interactions. Whatever might be growing between them, respect, friendship, perhaps something deeper, Helena was bound by vows she would not break. But the doctor's presence in her life reminded her that there were men in the world who could offer companionship of the mind as well as obligations of the heart. Lady Agatha watched this developing friendship with her characteristic shrewdness. One evening, after Dr. Galworth had departed, she called Helena to sit beside her. "You are half in love with him," the old woman said without preamble. Helena felt colour flood her face. "I am a married woman, my lady. Such feelings are inappropriate and impossible." "I did not say your feelings were appropriate, only that they exist." Lady Agatha's expression was kind but firm. "Dr. Galworth is a good man, and you are starved for kindness. It is natural that you should respond to his regard. But you must be careful, Helena, not because I fear you would act dishonorably. I know you would not, but because hope can be as dangerous as despair when it is misplaced." "I have no hope," Helena said quietly. "I understand my situation perfectly. The Duke and I have an arrangement, not a marriage. I will fulfill my duties and live my life as separately from him as possible. If Dr. Galworth's friendship brightens those separate hours, I see no harm in it." "The harm," Lady Agatha said gently, "is that it shows you what you are missing. It makes the cage more visible, even as it offers you a window to view the world beyond. But perhaps that is necessary. Perhaps you need to see what life could be, so that you can decide what life you will make for yourself within the constraints you face." The conversation troubled Helena, but she could not deny its truth. Dr. Galworth had awakened something in her, not romantic passion, though she felt the stirrings of attraction, but rather a sense of her own intellectual worth. She was not merely an ornament or a broodmare. She had thoughts and opinions that mattered, at least to some people. It was during her 6th week in Bath that the letter arrived from the Duke. His handwriting was as austere and controlled as everything else about him. The message was brief. Your presence is required at Gravesmore Castle for the Christmas season. The carriage will arrive for you on December 20th. G. No inquiry about her health or happiness. No explanation for why her presence was now required after weeks of deliberate separation. Simply a command, issued with the expectation of obedience. Helena sat in Lady Agatha's drawing room, the letter in her hand, and felt the walls of her cage descending once more. You must go, Lady Agatha said, reading her expression accurately. You are his wife, and this is a reasonable request. Besides, she added with a gleam in her eye, it is time you and Alexander had a proper conversation. This farce of a marriage cannot continue indefinitely with you both pretending the other does not exist. I do not know what I would say to him, Helena admitted. He has made his feelings abundantly clear. He despises my family and views me as the spoils of his revenge. What words could possibly bridge that divide? Perhaps none, Lady Agatha conceded. But perhaps actions might. You have spent these weeks rediscovering yourself, remembering that you are more than your family name or your husband's vengeance. Now you must show him what he has truly married, not a defeated victim but a woman of intelligence and strength. If Alexander cannot appreciate that, then the loss is his. As Helena prepared for her departure from Bath, Dr. Galworth called to bid her farewell. They met in Lady Agatha's garden, the winter air cold enough to show their breath. I shall miss our conversations, Your Grace, he said, and the sincerity in his voice made Helena's heart ache. As shall I, Dr. Galworth. You have given me a great gift these past weeks. You have reminded me that I have value beyond my family connections or my husband's regard. I will carry that knowledge with me. I hope, he said carefully, that the Duke proves worthy of you. But if he does not, I hope you will remember that there are those who see your true worth and honor it. It was as close to a declaration as propriety would allow, and Helena understood the risk he took in offering even that much. She extended her hand, and he took it, raising it briefly to his lips in a gesture that was both courtly and intimate. Thank you, Doctor, for everything. As the carriage carried her away from Bath, Helena looked back at the city that had become her refuge. She did not know what awaited her at Gravesmore Castle, but she was no longer the broken girl who had fled London 6 weeks ago. She was the Duchess of Gravesmore, and she would face her husband on her own terms, not his. The battle was not over. Indeed, it was only beginning. Gravesmore Castle stood atop a wind-swept hill in Derbyshire, a medieval fortress that had been expanded and refined over centuries into a Gothic monument of power and permanence. As Helena's carriage climbed the long drive, she saw it looming against the winter sky. Dark stone towers, crenellated walls, narrow windows that looked more like arrow slits than sources of light. It was magnificent and forbidding in equal measure, a fitting residence for the man who owned it. The Duke was waiting in the great hall when she arrived, standing before an enormous fireplace that did little to warm the cavernous space. He was dressed for country life in dark trousers and a well-tailored coat, his expression as unreadable as ever. But Helena thought she detected surprise in his eyes when he saw her, surprise and something else she could not identify. She had dressed carefully for this reunion, choosing a travelling costume of deep blue wool that Lady Agatha had insisted she commission in Bath. It was fashionable and elegant, and it made her look every inch the Duchess she had become. She walked toward him with measured steps, her head held high, and executed a perfect curtsy that was neither submissive nor mocking. Your Grace, I trust you are well. I am, he replied, and his voice was oddly cautious, as if he were approaching a stranger rather than the wife he had humiliated. Your journey was satisfactory? Quite satisfactory, thank you. Helena rose and met his eyes directly. "Your aunt was most kind in her hospitality. She sends her regards." "I am certain she does," the Duke said dryly, along with no doubt a litany of criticisms about my behavior. "Lady Agatha has her own opinions, which she expresses freely. I found her company enlightening." A silence stretched between them, awkward and weighted. Helena could see him reassessing her, noting the changes that 6 weeks had wrought. She was no longer the defeated bride who had fled his house in tears. She had been transformed by rest, intellectual engagement, and the recognition of her own worth. "You look well," he said finally, and it sounded almost like an accusation. "Thank you." Bath agreed with me. Helena looked around the great hall, taking in the ancient tapestries and suits of armor. "Will you show me the castle, Your Grace? As I am to spend Christmas here, I should like to know my surroundings." He hesitated, clearly not expecting her composure. "Of course, if you are not too fatigued from your journey." "Not at all. I am quite recovered." The tour of Gravesmore Castle was an exercise in sustained civility. The Duke showed her through endless corridors and chambers, the medieval Great Hall, the Elizabethan Long Gallery, the Georgian staterooms, the library that housed a collection of books and manuscripts dating back to the Crusades. He spoke with evident pride about his family's history, and Helena found herself genuinely interested, despite the tension between them. "The sixth Duke, your father, made significant improvements to the estate," she observed as they stood in the conservatory, a stunning glass structure filled with exotic plants. Lady Agatha spoke of his vision for modernizing the agricultural methods. "My father was a progressive, in many ways," the Duke replied, his voice softening slightly. "He believed that nobility carried responsibilities to the land and the people who worked it. He established schools for the tenants' children and improved their housing. It is part of why the loss of the Thornfield lands wounded him so deeply. He had plans for their development that would have benefited everyone." Helena heard the old grievance rising in his voice and made a decision to confront it directly. "Your Grace, may I speak frankly?" He turned to face her, his expression guarded. "By all means. My father's vote against the land grant was not personal betrayal. I have read the parliamentary records. Lady Agatha obtained them for me. The vote concerned a dispute over ancient boundaries that affected multiple properties. My father voted his conscience, based on legal advice, not out of malice toward the Gravesmore family. The fact that your father chose to interpret it as betrayal does not make that interpretation correct." The Duke's eyes flashed dangerously. "You dare to—" "I dare to speak truth," Helena interrupted, her voice remaining calm. "You have punished my family for a political disagreement that occurred before I was born. You have built your entire understanding of my father on a foundation of your father's wounded pride, and you have bound yourself to a woman you claim to despise in order to fulfill a deathbed oath that honor should never have demanded. You know nothing of honor," he said coldly. "I know that honor should build up, not tear down. I know that true justice requires understanding, not blind vengeance. And I know that you have trapped yourself as surely as you have trapped me, locked into a marriage neither of us wanted, for the sake of a ghost's demand for retribution." The Duke stared at her, and Helena saw fury warring with something else in his expression. Uncertainty, perhaps, or the first stirrings of doubt. "You have grown bold during your time in Bath. I have grown truthful. I spent weeks in the company of people who valued my mind and my opinions, who treated me as a person rather than a pawn. It has reminded me that I am worth more than your contempt, Your Grace. I will fulfill every duty required of me as your Duchess. I will manage your households and entertain your guests and give you heirs if that is what you require. But I will not spend the rest of my life cowering before your anger over events I did not cause and cannot change." She turned to leave the conservatory, but his voice stopped her. "Helena." It was the first time he had used her given name since their wedding. She paused, but did not turn back. He seemed to struggle with words, an unusual state for a man who was always in complete control. I have been informed that you conducted yourself impeccably in Bath, that you comported yourself as befits your position. I am pleased. It was not an apology, but it was perhaps the beginning of acknowledgement. Helena did turn then, and offered him a small, cool smile. I am gratified that my behaviour meets your standards, Your Grace. Now, if you will excuse me, I should like to rest before dinner. Christmas at Gravesmore Castle was a more elaborate affair than Helena had anticipated. The Duke had invited a selection of guests, neighbouring landowners, a few London friends, and to Helena's surprise and trepidation, Beatrice and Lord Edmund, whose engagement had been formally announced. Beatrice arrived in a flurry of excitement, throwing herself into Helena's arms with all the exuberance of youth. "Oh, Helena, I have missed you so, and this castle is magnificent. Edmund and I are to be married in April, and you must help me plan everything." Helena held her sister close, drinking in the simple joy of her presence. Here was the reason she had sacrificed so much, this girl's happiness, this chance at love. Seeing Beatrice radiant and hopeful made every humiliation worthwhile. The Duke observed their reunion from across the great hall, and when Helena caught his eye, she saw something unexpected there. Not the cold triumph she had anticipated, but a flicker of what might have been regret. The Christmas Eve ball at Gravesmore Castle was a showcase of the Duke's wealth and taste. The castle's ancient halls were transformed with evergreen boughs and candles, and guests arrived in their finest attire. Helena, dressed in a gown of silver silk that Lady Agatha had insisted she purchase, descended the grand staircase on her husband's arm, aware that every eye was upon them. The whispers about their disastrous wedding breakfast had reached even Derbyshire, and the guests were clearly eager to observe the Duke and his Duchess for signs of discord. Helena was determined to give them nothing to gossip about. She smiled and conversed graciously, played the perfect hostess, and demonstrated that she was entirely comfortable in her role. It was during the dancing that the evening took an unexpected turn. The Duke, as was traditional, led Helena out for the first dance, a minuet that required them to move in concert, their hands touching briefly in the figures of the dance. They had not been this close since their brief, cold wedding kiss, and Helena was acutely aware of his physical presence, the height of him, the strength evident even through the civilized veneer of evening clothes, the way his grey eyes watched her with that unnerving intensity. "You dance well," he said, as they came together in the pattern. "I was well taught, Your Grace." "Must you always address me so formally? We are married." Helena raised an eyebrow. "Would you prefer I address you as Alexander? Given that you have made your contempt for me abundantly clear, such intimacy seems inappropriate." "I do not." He paused as the dance separated them, then continued when they rejoined. "My feelings are more complicated than contempt." "How gratifying," Helena said coolly. "Pray do not elaborate. I find I prefer the clarity of your contempt to the confusion of your complications." Before he could respond, the dance ended, and other partners claimed them both. Helena found herself passed from one gentleman to another, engaging in the light flirtation and harmless conversation that social dancing demanded. She was aware of the Duke watching her even as he danced with other ladies, his expression growing progressively darker. It was Lord Edmund who precipitated the crisis. The young man, perhaps emboldened by punch or genuine gratitude, approached Helena during a break in the dancing. "Your Grace, I must thank you again for your intervention on behalf of Beatrice and myself. Without your sacrifice—" "Please, Lord Edmund," Helena interrupted gently. "What is past is past. I am simply happy that you and Beatrice will have the chance to marry for love. That is all that matters. Your sacrifice shall not be forgotten," he insisted earnestly, taking her hand. "If there is ever anything I can do to—" "Hartley!" The Duke's voice cut through the conversation like a blade. He had appeared beside them with startling speed, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. "I believe the next dance is beginning. Surely my sister-in-law requires your attention." It was not a suggestion, but a command. Edmund, recognizing danger, bowed quickly and retreated. Helena turned to face her husband, whose jaw was clenched tight enough to make the muscles jump. "That was unnecessarily rude, Your Grace. Lord Edmund was merely being polite." "Lord Edmund," the Duke said with dangerous quiet, "was being familiar. I will not have my wife the subject of every young fool's gratitude, or worse, his pity." "Your wife," Helena replied, her own temper rising, "can manage her own conversations without your interference. I have done nothing to shame you or your house. You are too free with your smiles and your attention. It encourages speculation and inappropriate regard." "What I am," Helena said clearly, "is civil and gracious, as a duchess should be. If you interpret basic courtesy as flirtation, that speaks more to your insecurity than to my behavior." The Duke's eyes blazed, and for a moment Helena thought he might actually lose his celebrated control. But instead, he took her arm in a grip just short of painful and steered her out of the ballroom and into the portrait gallery. "Insecurity?" he demanded once they were alone. "You think I am insecure?" "I think you are conflicted," Helena said, pulling her arm free. "You claim to despise me, to view our marriage as vengeance, yet you react with jealousy when other men show me basic courtesy. You cannot have it both ways, Your Grace. Either I am your enemy to be humiliated, or I am your wife to be respected. Choose." "It is not that simple." "It is exactly that simple. You have spent months treating me with contempt, only to grow angry when I find companionship and respect elsewhere. You have pushed me away at every opportunity, yet you resent the distance between us. What do you want from me, Alexander?" The use of his name seemed to shock him. They stood facing each other in the portrait gallery, surrounded by the painted eyes of generations of Gravesmores, and something shifted in the air between them. "I do not know," he said finally, and the admission seemed to cost him. "I thought I knew. I thought revenge would satisfy me, but instead I find myself unsettled." "Unsettled by what?" "By you. By the fact that you are not what I expected. You were supposed to be broken, grateful, meek. Instead, you have become formidable." Helena felt a strange surge of triumph. "Good. Then perhaps we can find a way to be married that does not require either of us to be broken." "I will never love you, Your Grace. You have made that impossible. But I can respect you if you can respect me in return. Can you do that?" He studied her face, and Helena held his gaze steadily, refusing to look away. Finally, he said, "I can try." It was not a declaration of affection or even friendship, but it was perhaps the beginning of an armistice. "Then let us return to our guests," Helena said, "and demonstrate that the Duke and Duchess of Gravesmore can at least present a united front, even if their private battles continue." She offered him her arm, a deliberate reversal of the usual arrangement. After a moment's hesitation, he took it, and together they walked back into the ballroom. The remainder of the Christmas season passed in a strange new state. Not quite peace, but not open warfare either. The Duke and Helena circled each other like cautious adversaries who had agreed to a temporary ceasefire, each testing the boundaries of this new arrangement. On Christmas morning, Helena found a small package beside her breakfast plate. Inside was a book, a first edition of Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. The note in the Duke's handwriting read simply, "Lady Agatha mentioned you might appreciate this. A.G." It was a peace offering, however small. Helena ran her fingers over the leather binding and felt something stir in her chest that might have been hope, dangerous, foolish hope. As the guests departed after Twelfth Night, the Duke requested a private audience with Helena in his study. She went expecting another confrontation, but instead found him standing by the fire, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. "I owe you an apology," he said without preamble, "for my behavior at our wedding breakfast. It was unconscionable." Helena had imagined this moment many times, had rehearsed cutting responses that would match his cruelty. But faced with his actual contrition, she found she no longer wanted to wound him. "It was," she agreed simply. "Why did you do it?" "Because I was angry. Because I had spent years building up this idea of revenge, and when it came to the moment, the reality was hollow. I had won. but the victory felt meaningless. So I lashed out, trying to convince myself that I had achieved something worthwhile. Instead, I merely proved myself a brute. Yes, Helena said. You did. He flinched but did not dispute it. I cannot undo what I have done, but I can promise that I will endeavor to treat you with the respect your position and your person deserves henceforth. That is all I ask, Your Grace. Well, that and one other thing. Name it. I wish to be useful. I have a mind and capabilities that are wasted in mere ornamental duties. Let me help manage the estates, the tenants' welfare, the charitable works. Let me be a partner in this marriage, even if we cannot be companions. The Duke considered this, then nodded slowly. My steward has been requesting assistance with the charity school initiative. If you are willing, I would welcome your involvement. It was a beginning. Not of love, certainly, but of something that might, in time, resemble partnership. As winter deepened into its coldest days, Helena stood at her chamber window, looking out over the frost-covered grounds of Gravesmore Castle, and reflected on how far she had come from that desperate girl who had offered herself in marriage to save her family. She had survived humiliation and isolation. She had rediscovered her own worth. And now, perhaps, she was beginning to forge a life that, while not the one she had dreamed of, might yet hold meaning and purpose. The cage remained, but she was learning to fly within it. Spring arrived late in Derbyshire, but when it finally came, it transformed Gravesmore Castle from a Gothic fortress into something almost romantic. The hills greened, wildflowers dotted the meadows, and the castle's severe stone walls warmed in the lengthening sunlight. Helena had spent the winter months working alongside the Duke's steward to expand the charity school program, and she found genuine satisfaction in the work. The children of the estate workers were bright and eager, and watching them learn gave Helena a sense of purpose she had never experienced in London drawing rooms. Her relationship with the Duke had evolved into something complex and undefined. They were not enemies, but neither were they friends. They maintained separate chambers and separate lives for the most part, coming together for meals and estate business, with a civility that would have seemed warm to casual observers, but which both of them recognized as carefully constructed neutrality. Yet there were moments, unexpected, unsettling moments, when Helena caught her husband watching her with an expression she could not decipher. And there were times when she found herself noticing things about him that had nothing to do with their conflict. The way he listened intently when the steward presented reports from the tenant farms, the patience he showed with his elderly servants, the hours he spent in his study, reviewing legal documents to ensure his people were fairly treated. He was not the monster she had believed him to be at their wedding. He was a complicated man, wounded by his father's legacy and trapped by his own rigid sense of honor. Understanding this did not excuse his cruelty, but it made him human rather than demonic. The invitation to Beatrice's wedding arrived in March, and with it came an unexpected dilemma. Helena desperately wished to attend, but the wedding was to be held at the Langford country church near Thornfield Manor, the family seat that represented everything the Duke had sought to destroy. She approached him in his study one evening, clutching the invitation. "Your Grace, my sister is to be married in April. I would very much like to attend." He looked up from his correspondence, and Helena saw the conflict play across his features. "At Thornfield Manor. Yes, I understand that the location may be difficult for you, given the history. If you prefer, I will attend alone." The Duke set down his pen and leaned back in his chair. "Do you wish me to accompany you?" The question surprised her. I had not assumed you would be willing. Your sister's marriage is occurring because of the agreement between us," he said carefully. "It seems appropriate that I should acknowledge that, however uncomfortable the setting." Helena felt a rush of gratitude that she quickly suppressed. She could not afford to soften toward him too much. "That is generous of you." "It is practical," he corrected, but his expression suggested something more complex than mere practicality. The journey to Thornfield Manor was Helena's first return home since her marriage 5 months earlier. As the familiar landscape rolled past her carriage window, she felt a tangle of emotions: nostalgia for her childhood, grief for the innocence she had lost, and a strange distance, as if she were viewing her former life through glass. Her father met them at the door, older and frailer than Helena remembered, but with more peace in his eyes than he had shown in years. His greeting to the Duke was stiff but civil, and Helena saw her husband respond with equal formality. It was not forgiveness on either side, but it was acknowledgement that the war between their houses had reached, if not resolution, at least exhaustion. Beatrice, radiant in her happiness, embraced Helena with tears of joy. "I cannot believe you are truly here, and that the Duke has come as well." She lowered her voice, studying Helena's face with sisterly concern. Are you happy, dearest?" Helena smiled, though it did not quite reach her eyes. "I am content, which is perhaps more than I expected. And you are glowing with happiness. That is all that matters to me." Indeed, the wedding was simple but lovely, held in the ancient stone church where generations of Langfords had been christened, married and mourned. Helena watched her sister exchange vows with Lord Edmund, saw the love shining in both their faces, and felt the bittersweet ache of vicarious joy. This was what she had purchased with her own sacrifice, this moment of pure, uncomplicated happiness. Beside her, the Duke sat rigidly, his expression unreadable. But when Beatrice and Edmund sealed their marriage with a kiss, Helena saw her husband's jaw tighten, and she wondered what thoughts were moving behind his grey eyes. The wedding breakfast at Thornfield Manor was a smaller, warmer affair than the Duke and Helena's had been. There were toasts and laughter, and when it came time for the bride's father to speak, the Earl of Thornfield rose with tears in his eyes. "My daughter Beatrice has found happiness with a good man who loves her truly," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "This marriage is a blessing I once feared would never come to pass, and it is made possible by the sacrifice of my elder daughter, Helena, who gave up her own chance at such happiness so that her sister might have hers." The room fell silent, all eyes turning to Helena. She felt her face flush, uncomfortable with the public acknowledgement of what she preferred to keep private. But before she could respond, the Duke rose from his seat beside her. "If I may," he said, and his voice carried the authority that made everyone listen. "The Duchess of Gravesmore did indeed make a sacrifice, but not in the way you imagine. She did not give up happiness, she redefined it. She has proven herself to be intelligent, capable, and stronger than anyone, including myself, gave her credit for. She has brought honor to the Gravesmore name and dignity to our union. Whatever the circumstances of our marriage's beginning, I count myself fortunate to call her my Duchess." The speech was not a declaration of love, but it was public recognition of her worth from a man who had once sworn to destroy her. Helena met his eyes across the table and saw something there that made her breath catch. Not affection precisely, but respect, and perhaps the first stirrings of something more. The guests applauded, the moment passed, and the celebration continued. But Helena could not forget the Duke's words, or the way he had defended her before her family. It was a small thing, perhaps, but in the context of their fraught marriage, it felt momentous. That evening, as the celebration wound down, Helena found herself alone in Thornfield's garden, a place she had loved as a child. She was standing by the rose arbor, remembering afternoons spent reading here, when footsteps approached. "You have been avoiding me since the toast," the Duke said, his voice emerging from the twilight. "Not avoiding, thinking." He came to stand beside her, and for once his presence felt less like confrontation and more like companionship. "What conclusions have you reached? That we are both trapped by circumstances neither of us chose, but that perhaps we need not be enemies within our trap. Your words today, they meant more to me than you know. I spoke only truth. You have exceeded every expectation. Low expectations, given that you expected me to be a defeated victim. Fair," he conceded, "but exceeded nonetheless." He hesitated, then added, "Helena, I know I cannot undo the harm I have caused, but I would like to try to build something different between us. Not love. I do not expect that, and I imagine you do not wish it. But partnership, perhaps. Mutual respect. A marriage that is more than simply endured. Helena turned to face him fully. The last light of day caught his features, softening the harsh lines that anger and grief had carved there. He was not an easy man, would never be an easy man. But he was trying, and that was more than she had dared hope for. I would like that as well, she said quietly, but it will require honesty between us. No more games or power struggles. If we are to be partners, we must trust each other. Agreed. He extended his hand, and after a moment, Helena took it. His grip was firm and warm, and she felt something shift between them. Not desire, not yet, but potential. They stood in the garden as darkness fell, hands clasped, and Helena realized that for the first time since her wedding, she felt something other than resignation about her marriage. She felt curiosity about what they might build together if they could put aside their weapons and try. The return to Gravesmore Castle brought new patterns to their daily life. The Duke began dining with Helena more frequently, and their conversations expanded beyond estate business to books, politics, philosophy. He had a sharp mind and surprisingly liberal views on many subjects, and Helena found herself enjoying their debates even when they disagreed. He also began to consult her on decisions that he had previously made unilaterally. When a dispute arose between tenants over water rights, he asked for her perspective. When he considered investing in a new agricultural technique, he sought her opinion on how it might affect the workers' families. Slowly, incrementally, he was making space for her in his life beyond the purely ornamental. And Helena, for her part, found herself watching him with growing interest. She noticed the way he smiled, rare but transforming when it occurred. She observed his hands as he worked through papers, strong and capable. She found herself aware of him in ways that had nothing to do with duty and everything to do with the simple fact that he was an attractive man whom she was beginning, against all odds, to understand. One evening in May, as they walked through the portrait gallery after dinner, the Duke stopped before a painting of a young woman in Tudor dress. "That is Catherine Gravesmore," he said. "She lived during Queen Elizabeth's reign and was renowned for her intelligence and political acumen. She saved the family estates during a time of religious persecution by negotiating directly with the Queen. Family legend says she was fearless." "She sounds remarkable," Helena said, studying the painted face with its direct gaze and slight smile. "She reminds me of you," the Duke said quietly. And when Helena turned to him in surprise, she found him looking not at the portrait but at her. "You have that same quality, that refusal to be diminished by circumstance. I did not recognize it at first. I was too blinded by my own anger, but I see it now." Helena felt something warm unfurl in her chest, something dangerous and unwelcome. She could not afford to care for him, could not risk giving her heart to the man who had once sought to destroy her. Yet something was shifting, like ice breaking in a spring thaw. "Thank you," she managed. "That means more than you know." He stepped closer, and Helena's breath caught. They had not been truly alone like this since their wedding night, such as it was, with her fleeing to her separate chamber and him making no attempt to stop her. Now, in the intimate dimness of the portrait gallery, she was acutely aware of his proximity, of the way his eyes had darkened to smoke. "Helena," he said, and his voice was rough. "I would very much like to kiss you, not as I did at our wedding. That was a mockery of affection, but properly, if you would permit it." Her heart hammered against her ribs. She should refuse. Allowing physical intimacy would complicate everything, would give him power over her emotions that she had sworn not to grant. But she found herself wanting it, wanting to know if there could be warmth between them, if the partnership they were building might someday include genuine feeling. "Yes," she whispered. "You may." He cupped her face in his hands with surprising gentleness, tilting her chin up. His thumb brushed her cheek, and Helena's eyes fluttered closed. When his lips met hers, it was nothing like their wedding kiss. This was slow and questioning, a tentative exploration rather than a claim. Helena felt heat spread through her body, felt her hands rise to grip his coat, felt herself lean into the kiss despite every rational thought urging caution. When they finally separated, both were breathing hard. The Duke rested his forehead against hers, his hands still framing her face. "I do not deserve your regard," he said softly, "but I find myself desperately wanting to earn it nonetheless." Helena opened her eyes and met his gaze, seeing vulnerability there for the first time. "Then earn it," she said, "not with words or gestures, but with constancy. Show me that the man I am beginning to know is real, not simply another strategy in your campaign." "I swear it," he said, and kissed her again. Summer settled over Gravesmore Castle with gentle warmth, and with it came a transformation that Helena would not have believed possible 6 months earlier. The Duke, Alexander as she now called him in private, had proven true to his word. Their marriage had evolved into something that resembled genuine partnership, and increasingly something that felt like affection. They had not rushed into physical intimacy beyond kisses stolen in quiet moments. Both understood that trust, once shattered, required patience to rebuild. But there were nights when Helena found herself wishing her husband would cross the invisible boundary between their chambers, and mornings when she caught Alexander watching her with barely concealed longing. The change in their relationship had not gone unnoticed. Mrs. Ashworth wore a perpetual expression of satisfaction, and Lady Agatha, visiting for a fortnight in June, had observed the Duke and Helena together and declared herself cautiously optimistic that my nephew is learning to use his brain instead of his pride. More importantly, Helena had found genuine purpose in her role as Duchess. The charity school had expanded to 3 locations across the estate, and she had established a lending library for the tenants, stocked with books on agriculture, basic medicine, and literature. She visited the families regularly, learning their names and their concerns, and she found that they trusted her in ways they had never trusted the Duke alone. He was their lord, remote and powerful, but she was approachable, sympathetic. Alexander had watched her work with growing respect and something else, something that looked very much like pride. He had begun consulting her on all major estate decisions, and Helena had discovered that she had a talent for administration and problem-solving. Together they were making Gravesmore not just profitable but progressive, a model estate that other landowners watched with interest. It was in late July that Dr. Galworth arrived at Gravesmore Castle. Helena had continued to correspond with the physician, and when he wrote mentioning his desire to establish a rural clinic and asking if she knew of any suitable locations, she had immediately thought of Gravesmore's empty dower house. She had discussed the idea with Alexander, who had agreed that a resident physician would benefit the estate workers, and they had extended an invitation for Dr. Galworth to visit and assess the suitability of the property. Helena had told herself that her motives were purely practical. The estate needed a doctor. Dr. Galworth needed a location for his clinic. It was a logical arrangement. But as the day of his arrival approached, she found herself anxious in ways that had nothing to do with logic. Alexander, with his uncanny ability to read her moods, had noticed. "You are troubled," he observed over breakfast the morning of Dr. Galworth's expected arrival. "Not troubled, merely thoughtful. About our guest." His tone was casual, but Helena detected an edge beneath it. "About whether this arrangement will serve all parties well," she said carefully. "A resident physician is a significant addition to the estate, and not perhaps about the fact that you and this physician were close during your time in Bath." Helena set down her teacup with deliberate care. "Lady Agatha told you. My aunt tells me many things, usually for my own good." Alexander's expression was difficult to read. "She mentioned that Dr. Galworth showed you particular attention and that you responded warmly to it. He treated me with respect and valued my intellect during a time when I desperately needed both," Helena said evenly. "I will not apologize for that friendship. I am not asking you to apologize. I am asking you to be honest with me about your feelings for him." Helena considered her answer carefully. "I admired him. I was grateful for his kindness. And yes, there was a moment when I thought, but I was and am a married woman. Nothing inappropriate occurred, nor will it ever occur. You have my word on that." Alexander was silent for a long moment, his fingers drumming against the table. Then he said, "I believe you, but I also understand that affection does not always follow rules of propriety. If you have feelings for this man—" "I have feelings for my husband," Helena interrupted, the words emerging before she could stop them. "Complicated, frustrating, occasionally infuriating feelings, but feelings nonetheless. Dr. Galworth represents a moment in my life when I was recovering from terrible wounds that you inflicted. I will always be grateful to him, but what I feel for you—" She paused, gathering courage. "What I feel for you is far more substantial and terrifying." Alexander's eyes had darkened to storm grey. "Terrifying?" "Because you have the power to wound me in ways Dr. Galworth never could. Because I swore I would never care for you, and yet I find myself doing so anyway. Because loving you would be the greatest foolishness I could commit, and I very much fear I am on the verge of that foolishness." The Duke rose from his chair and moved around the table to where Helena sat. He knelt beside her, taking her hands in his. "Then let us be foolish together, because I have been halfway in love with you since the night you faced me down in the portrait gallery and told me I had to choose between contempt and respect. And I have been entirely in love with you since I watched you teach reading to tenant children with more patience and joy than I have ever witnessed." Helena felt tears prick her eyes. "You love me?" "Desperately, inconveniently, and completely," Alexander said, and there was wonder in his voice, as if he himself could hardly believe it. "I know I have no right to your affection. I know I wounded you terribly. But if you could find it in yourself to forgive me, to give us a true chance—" Helena silenced him with a kiss, pouring into it all the confused, complicated emotions of the past months. When they separated, both were trembling. "I forgive you," she whispered. "Not because you deserve it, but because I choose to. Because holding on to anger is exhausting, and I would rather spend my energy building something beautiful with you than maintaining walls between us." "Then we shall build it together," Alexander promised. "Starting now, starting with honesty and trust and the determination to be better than our beginning." When Dr. Galworth arrived that afternoon, he found the Duke and Duchess of Gravesmore united in a way that made his position immediately clear. Helena greeted him warmly, but formally, and Alexander stood beside her, with his hand resting possessively on the small of her back. The physician was intelligent enough to recognize the changed dynamic, and if he felt any disappointment, he hid it admirably. The tour of the Dower House was conducted with perfect propriety, and by evening arrangements had been made for Dr. Galworth to establish his clinic there. Over dinner, the three discussed plans for providing medical care to the estate workers, and Helena found that she could appreciate the doctor's friendship without any awkwardness now that her feelings for Alexander were acknowledged. After Dr. Galworth retired for the evening, Alexander drew Helena into his study and closed the door behind them. "That went well, I think," he said, and there was relief in his voice. "Were you worried?" "I was terrified," he admitted. "Terrified that you would look at him and regret choosing me, that you would see in him everything I am not, gentle, kind, uncomplicated." Helena laughed softly. "I do not want gentle or uncomplicated. I want you, difficult, proud, occasionally infuriating you. I want the man who challenges me and respects me and is learning to love me despite having sworn to hate my family. That man is far more interesting than any alternative." Alexander pulled her close, burying his face in her hair. "I do not deserve you, but I will spend the rest of my life trying to. See that you do," Helena murmured. And then they were kissing again, with more heat and urgency than before. When Alexander finally pulled away, his eyes were nearly black with desire. "Helena, He swallowed hard. "I would very much like to truly make you my wife, if you are ready, if you wish it. Helena's heart raced. This was the final barrier between them, the last remnant of their damaged beginning. Crossing it would mean complete vulnerability, complete trust. But as she looked into her husband's eyes and saw the love there, real, undeniable love, she knew her answer. Yes, she said simply, I wish it. That night, for the first time, Helena did not sleep in her separate chamber, and in the morning she woke in Alexander's arms and knew that she was, against all odds, happy. The months that followed were a time of deep contentment. Helena and Alexander had finally found their way to each other, and the change in their relationship permeated every aspect of life at Gravesmore. The Duke smiled more, laughed more, and the staff whispered that Her Grace had worked a miracle on their austere master. In September, Helena confirmed what she had suspected for several weeks. She was with child. Alexander received the news with uncharacteristic emotion, gathering her into his arms and holding her as if she were made of spun glass. A child, he breathed. Our child. Helena, you have given me so much. We have given each other much, she corrected. This child is the product of what we have built together, from ashes and anger to something real and good. The pregnancy proceeded smoothly, and Helena found that she enjoyed the changes in her body, the sense of nurturing life. Alexander was absurdly protective, ordering her to rest at the slightest sign of fatigue and consulting with Dr. Galworth repeatedly about her health. Helena bore his excessive concern with amused patience, recognizing it for what it was, love expressed through worry. It was during her 7th month, as winter approached once more, that Helena received a letter from her father. The Earl was failing, his health declining rapidly, and he wished to see her before the end. Helena and Alexander travelled to Thornfield Manor, despite the advanced state of her pregnancy, Dr. Galworth accompanying them out of medical prudence. They found the Earl confined to his bed, frail and diminished, but at peace. Helena sat beside him, holding his weathered hand, while Alexander stood respectfully at the foot of the bed. "My dear girl," the Earl said, his voice barely a whisper, "you look radiant, happier than I ever hoped to see you." "I am happy, Father, truly." "And you, Your Grace," the Earl addressed Alexander directly. "Do you love my daughter?" "With everything I am," Alexander replied without hesitation. The Earl smiled. "Then I can die content. Helena, I am so sorry for the circumstances that led to your marriage, but I am grateful that you have found happiness despite them." "You gave me life twice, Father," Helena said, tears streaming down her face. "Once when I was born, and again when you instilled in me the strength to survive anything. I would not trade that gift for all the world." The Earl died peacefully 3 days later, with both his daughters at his side. Helena grieved deeply, but it was a clean grief, uncomplicated by regrets or unsaid words. Her father had seen her happy. That knowledge brought comfort even through sorrow. The child came in February, during a snowstorm that blanketed Gravesmore Castle in white. Helena laboured for hours, Alexander pacing anxiously outside her chamber, while Dr. Galworth and a midwife attended her. When the baby finally emerged, wailing lustily, the doctor came out with a broad smile. "Your Grace, you have a son, a healthy, strong son, and the Duchess is well." Alexander burst into the room, ignoring protocol, and found Helena propped against pillows, exhausted but beaming, with a small bundle in her arms. She looked up at him with such love that he felt his throat tighten. "Come meet your son," she said softly. He approached slowly, almost reverently, and looked down at the tiny face, red and wrinkled and perfect. The baby had dark hair like his, and Helena's hazel eyes. Alexander touched one impossibly small hand, and the infant's fingers curled around his. "He is perfect," Alexander whispered. "You are perfect, Helena. His voice broke. "Thank you. For this. For everything. For forgiving me when I deserved only your hatred. You have given me a life I never imagined possible." "We gave it to each other," Helena said, reaching up to touch his face. "This is what we built from our broken beginning. Love, family, purpose. We took the worst circumstances and transformed them into something beautiful. What shall we name him? Alexander asked, unable to look away from his son. Helena smiled. I thought perhaps Thomas, after my father, and for his second name Philip after yours, if you approve. Thomas Philip Gravesmore, Alexander said, testing the name. It is perfect. He is perfect. You are... He leaned down to kiss her forehead. You are everything. As spring returned to Gravesmore Castle, Helena stood at her chamber window, watching Alexander walk through the gardens with their son in his arms, pointing out the flowering trees and explaining the world to a baby far too young to understand. She thought of the frightened girl who had offered herself in marriage to save her family, and the broken woman who had wept in this very house after her public humiliation. That girl was gone. In her place stood the Duchess of Gravesmore, confident, capable, beloved. She had not chosen the circumstances of her marriage, but she had chosen what to make of them. She had chosen forgiveness over bitterness, partnership over enmity, and love over fear. Helena placed her hand over her heart, feeling it beat strong and steady, and smiled. She had bloomed where she was planted, transforming a cage into a garden, a weapon into a tool, an enemy into the greatest love of her life. And that, she thought, was the truest form of victory, not defeating one's adversaries, but transforming oneself into someone who no longer needed to fight, someone who had found peace, not by changing circumstances, but by refusing to be diminished by them. The future stretched before her, full of possibility. She had a husband who loved her, a son who would grow up knowing affection and respect between his parents, and a purpose that gave her days meaning. She had her sister happily married, her father's memory honored, and a family name restored. Most importantly, she had herself, whole, strong, and free in ways that had nothing to do with circumstances and everything to do with choice. As Alexander caught sight of her at the window and raised their son's tiny hand in a wave, Helena waved back, her heart full to bursting. This was not the life she had imagined as a girl. It was better. It was real. It was earned. And it was, gloriously and unexpectedly, hers. Thank you for joining me on Helena and Alexander's journey from enemies to soulmates. If you enjoyed this story, please click the like button, subscribe for more tales of love triumphing over adversity, and comment below to let me know what you thought. Which moment touched your heart most? I'd love to hear from you. Until next time, remember, we all have the power to bloom where we're planted, no matter how difficult the soil.